Oh, hello. We're almost there. Yay. Um, there we go. The idea of Jesus dying and being resurrected is something that we looked at this before, and we're kind of going to recap just a little bit here for the next few slides. Spoke to that again, and we think they would get it, right? I mean, you think when Jesus said, it's going to happen, I'm going to die, I'm going to be handed over, you think it would sink in. But, we don't always hear the things we don't want to hear in life, do we? And I think that was the case with them. We tend to hear kind of what we want to hear. I think it's an old adage, it's what did I say and what did you hear? Sometimes I say something, my wife gives me that look, and I don't say, what did I say? I said, what did you hear me say? Because obviously I didn't communicate well. So I think, you have to understand that. And with Jesus, I think it's the same way. He was pretty straightforward here. The Son of Man has to be delivered to the hands of men. But they didn't understand it, right? They didn't. Luke says it was concealed from them, so they would not perceive it. So Luke almost puts a godly spin on this, In other words, God was kind of still concealing it from them, even though Jesus was saying it. And Jesus said some things about being risen again in John, and he says, I'm telling you this now, right? So that when it happens, you'll believe. In other words, Jesus was putting this on their ears, putting it in their heart. So when it did come to pass, they would go, oh, I remember that. I remember Jesus saying that. In other words, it was going to give them some proof, some recollection of things that were going to happen. And so Jesus was using it in that respect to give them that hindsight, in a sense, that, yes, that was said. They didn't want to ask him about it. Matthew says they were deeply grieved. Matthew says, rise again on the third day. They were deeply grieved. So we get some differences here in perception, right, from the gospel writers of exactly how they took it. And, one hymn, Matthew says they were grieved. Luke says it was hidden. It's kind of interesting, though, right, if you think about it. Luke's more our historian, right? He's more writing from what people are telling him. This isn't firsthand for him, right? So it's kind of interesting, his take. Now, Matthew, of course, was there. So Matthew, his take was a little different, right? Luke's writing from probably, who do you think Luke really heard the most? Who's Luke's point of reference? Mary to some extent, I'm sure, but I think Peter too predominantly was Luke's source. So he's kind of getting that perspective as we look at it. And Mark's always a little more straightforward, right? They will kill him, and when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. Luke's pretty blunt. Mark's pretty blunt. Mark's always that way. Mark's kind of the military guy, the Roman guy in the whole gist of things. I saw a thing a long time ago down at Winterfest from when Oklahoma Christian put that on, and they had the 4 gospel writers up there and dressed up like they would be, and it's always stuck in my head. I kind of wish I could find that on YouTube and play it for you because it was kind of interesting. But they had, Matthew was in the Jewish garb. He had on his prayer shawl and his phylacteries on his arm and his forehead, and the Jewish look, And Mark was dressed in camouflage. So, kind of the deal, And Luke had on his little scholar's hat, He was the scholar, the historian, and John was dressed in 60s tie-dye, right? Which I thought was really fitting for John, because that's kind of where John is, right? John is love, right? And he's always everywhere. So I thought it's always stuck in my head when I think of these guys. I always kind of think of them like that, Matthew's our little priestly guy. Mark's our Roman. He's real straightforward to the point. And, Luke's our historian, and, John's just kind of out there. somewhere. You know, you got to love John, right? John's just kind of out there in some respect. So, but anyway, it's kind of gives you it's kind of a perspective of these guys. You know, when you look at the tribute money, and this is a case that really we see in Matthew, and that's something you kind of see because, you know, Matthew's the Jew. So Matthew is more, this is more his thing than it would be Mark or Luke or John, you know, necessarily. He kind of has that Jewish perspective. And the temple tax is something that's uniquely Jewish, right? It's every male has to pay it, right? Every male by law, in the law, has to pay the temple tax. So it's something they're required to pay. But there's a lesson in this tax. I always thought this was really an interesting little passage. The ones who collected, I always thought that was kind of interesting. Those who collected the 2 drachma tax. So apparently there were people that went out and actually did this. I always kind of thought from the law, from the Old Testament, it's something that the males paid when they went to the temple, something you did when you went to the temple, almost like a poll tax. But apparently these guys are out collecting. So apparently they go out to collect this tax, and he says, does he not pay the 2 drachma tax? And he answered yes, and then when he came into the house, Jesus spoke, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers? And Peter said, from strangers. And Jesus said to him, the sons are exempt. However, so what's Jesus saying to them? You know, he's saying, I should be exempt from this tax because I'm the Son of God, right? Who do you exact the tax from? From strangers? And he's saying, so I shouldn't pay the tax. But once again, Jesus, the way Jesus does, Jesus went along. Oftentimes he did to keep things. He existed in a real weird world, didn't he? He had to kind of keep the Romans on his side. He had to kind of keep the Jews. He couldn't really offend them to the point they were going to do something, yet he knew ultimately they were going to do something. Jesus walked a very fine line on this earth. And so Jesus says, I'm going to, he says, says, go to the sea and throw in a hook. Why didn't he just go to Judas? Were they the only ones there, do you think? Peter and Jesus? Is interesting. You don't really see anyone else there, do you? Where's Judas? He's the treasurer, right? He has the money box. Where's he, right, in this discourse, right? Is he not there? Do they not have the money? I think they had the money. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, it's definitely it's a teaching moment for sure. And not only that, the drachma is Jewish money. It's temple money. It's not Roman money. And to pay the temple tax with Roman money, that would have been offensive because Roman money had whose image on it? Yeah, had Caesar on it, right? And that would have been offensive to the Jew. So that's how come when Jesus went into the temple, there were money changers because you couldn't pay temple money in Roman coin. That would have been offensive, had a graven image. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? He rendered under Caesar what Caesar's, and he rendered unto the Jews what was the Jews, didn't he? Like I said, Jesus walked a fine line, didn't he? I don't think Jesus ever really made the state that he thought he had to or didn't have to. I think Jesus' point was render under Caesar what Caesar's. In other words, Caesar's image on it, give it back to him. I think in Jesus's, like I said, Jesus had a unique way of walking that line. You know, the Jews would have loved for Jesus to have said, you know, don't pay tax to Caesar. That's what they wanted him to say. But Jesus kind of understood that, you know, they needed to pay tax to Caesar. Jesus was never militant in his approach, and that's once again you see him kind of going along with things in order not to cause a ruckus with things. You know, I think as a Christian, we kind of walk in that world sometimes, you know, and that's some of a hard balance to make is, You know, where do you draw the line on things like that? Jesus obviously thought, it's okay. I need to give back to Caesar. We're under Roman rule. That's the law. You need to do the law. But also Jesus in this case was like, yeah, this is the law. I should really be exempt, yet I'm going to do it. What a miracle. We don't really think of this as a miracle, but wouldn't that be a miracle to catch a fish and have exactly the amount of money you needed for McDonald's Happy Meal in his mouth, right? I mean, that's a pretty good miracle in itself, isn't it? To have 2 drachma in his mouth. And where'd the fish get that? Did he get that off the ocean floor? Did God miraculously put it in his mouth? I have all these questions I don't have answers to, obviously. But I always think it's interesting to think about. Mm-hmm. Specific fish, not a group. Don't get a whole group and find one. Yeah, very specific. Get a hook. First fish that comes up, right? Yeah. Why didn't he just give him the money? Because God never works like that, ever. And that's something we don't look at enough in life. You know, there's always the agency of man in everything God does, just about exclusive. Oh, there's maybe some exceptions. I can think of a couple. But predominantly in the Bible, in life, God depends on us to do something, so he'll do something. It's always that way, right? I mean, why didn't God just take Noah and his family up into heaven, let the earth flood, put him back on earth, right? Because he said, Noah, you got to have agency. You got to build an ark, right? Why didn't God just defeat the armies when Moses was leading the Egyptians out? He said, you got to hold up your staff. And when he had let down his staff, they'd win. Remember that? And his arms got tired, and they had to hold his arms up, remember? You know, why does God do that? Because God expects man to have agency. God expects man to do something, to get something. It's just how it is. And, you know, we can't forget that. God expects us to do that. And that's the same way here. Why didn't he just miraculously make 2 coins appear and say, here you go, Peter, go give it to him? Because what's the lesson in that? Where's man's agency in that? You know, God says, you go do what I tell you to do, and something's going to happen. Right? And I think that's just a real God thing. Throughout the Bible, it's just a God thing. Throw down your mantle. I mean, think of all the examples in your head. I mean, there's a couple of times I can think of where the angel of the Lord destroyed the army, that man really didn't have anything to do with that. But predominantly in Scripture, not exclusively, but predominantly, man has agency in what God does. God always calls some person to go do something, so God will do something. Just how it is. God calls us to the same thing. He says, do what I say, be obedient. I'm going to give you something. Don't be obedient. You have agency. Same way with Peter. It's just a lesson from God. You know, do what I say. Obedience in the Bible. Obedience in the Bible of God's people always yielded results. Always yielded results. So I just think that's why God does things that way. He says, we talked about this a little bit last week, since I didn't have my PowerPoint slides. The idea of a child coming. I'm going to speak about this some in my sermon this morning. Who will be the greatest? And he sets a child before him. And he says, whoever receives a child in my name receives me, whoever receives him who sent me. We spoke about this last week. And, you know, it's a great lesson, right? But not talking about children. The children's the illustration, but talking about those young in the faith, people in the kingdom, and what will happen to them if you don't receive them. And I think that's something that we spoke quite a bit about last Sunday. We're going to speak some about in our sermon. But it's a great lesson. We always think about the children coming to Jesus and Jesus using them as an example of those in the kingdom, those young in the faith. Yes, Sam? Yeah, but in that passage, he says what? He says, don't prohibit the children from coming to me, because the kingdom of heaven belongs to what? Such as these. So once again, it was an illustration. You know, Jesus, I agree, Jesus loved children, and Jesus took the children into him, which was very odd for a teacher, you know, especially a Jewish teacher, because they just didn't do that. But I think Jesus was that exception, you know, let the children come unto me. But once again, there was, in every case of that, he always used that kind of that illustrative point. You know, the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. Right. Oh, I agree. I take this to heart. You know, those of you that know me, you know, I try to take extra pains with our kids, and you know, I do that for a reason, because I take that to heart. You know, I think that kids need to be heard, and kids need to be listened to, and you know, if we don't listen to them in the church, then you know, what does that say to our children? You know, we have to listen to our children, and we should listen to them. We should take time to get down on their level and talk to them and understand them. And I was thinking about that this morning, and I'm thinking, man, I'm just looking at myself in the mirror, and I'm like, man, I'm getting old. I'm gray-headed, got this big gray beard, and yet I'm in the floor playing with these little kids. It's probably disrespectful, but the truth is that I do the VBS songs and get up here and jump around with the kids, and I'm thinking, at what point in my life? I was thinking that this morning. I said, at what point in my life am I going to be too old to do that? And I think my answer was, I'm never going to be too old to do that. You know, so I think we don't need to look over our children, for sure. And I think Jesus was a great example of that. And, they need to be able to talk to us, and we need to have a relationship with them. And I think that's important in the church. The church is for everybody, not just for the elderly or the middle-aged, but it's for our babies and our young and our kids too. And, we need to be inclusive. And I think Jesus understood that in faith. We need to be inclusive. And I think that you see that, right? And I do think there's great lessons in what Christ did. And I definitely take that to heart. And, I learned a long time ago from a guy that's dead now, but a friend of mine that wasn't a Christian, but he always, kids always really loved him, and he always had a rapport with even my children, especially my children were little. But I always noticed the first thing that he did was, when he come up and there were kids, he always got down on their level and talked to them and took time to talk to them. And I kind of took that to heart. I think that's, don't talk down to kids. Jesus, I think, we always see the picture of Jesus setting and the children coming up and Jesus putting them in his lap. Now, whether or not that's how that happened, I don't know. That's the artist's rendition, right? It's what's in our head because it's what we see. But I think Jesus took time to not to talk down to kids, not to talk down to children, which is we tend to tower above them and talk down. And I think if we put ourselves in a kid's position, a little kid's position, they're always looking up. They're always looking up at us all the time. And, I think that's to get on their level and speak to them and treat them like people that they are. And I think that's important. And getting off track. But I think our children, I was thinking this morning, actually, I was in my head, I was thinking about this morning, I was getting ready, how important our children are and how we need to interact with our kids, and wondering when I'm going to be too old to do that, obviously. But yeah, I guess I'm too old to get up. He really puts it down to this idea we talked about this last week. Who's not against us is for us. He gives you a cup of water to drink because your name is followers of Christ. He will not lose his reward. The idea that they need to quit fighting against those people who are using Jesus' name. They need to understand who the true enemy was. And I think that's something we often need to keep in our hearts, keep in our minds. This is really getting to my sermon this morning, so I really don't want to spend a lot of time here. But what a punishment, right, for that. I actually been studying on that this week quite a bit. That's a non-survivable punishment. Agree with me? Millstone on your neck, cast into the sea. Yeah. Yeah. That's not the depth of the sea. That's not a survivable. That's not a survivable punishment. That's not like saying you need to go whoop them or scourge them or do something. That's not survivable. And I think that's a pretty serious consequence, isn't it? And like I said, I'm really getting into my sermon here. I'm going to talk about this a lot in a little bit, but Jesus speaks about the stumbling blocks that come. It is inevitable stumbling blocks come. But woe to the man through whom the stumbling block comes. Talks about it's better to maim ourselves than to lose heaven. How bad is it to cause someone to stumble? Look at the context of the passage. Like I said, I'm really getting to my sermon. I hate to do that, but look at the context of the passage. The context of the passage is you're causing a little one to stumble, little one being little one in the kingdom of heaven. The punishment for that's death, right? And then he says, it's going to happen, but woe to you. If you're going to do that, it would be better for you to be maimed than to do that, than to cause someone to stumble and miss heaven. For us to cause someone to miss heaven, when we're called to get people to heaven, how serious of an offense is that? Right? Yeah. Well, it can be, anybody can jump in here anytime you want. I'm just wide open. No, it can be a lot of different things. And it's hard as a Christian. Can I offend someone in a way to cause them to forsake their faith? You should not be able to do that, realistically. Can you do it? Yes, especially with people who are young in the faith, weak in the faith. Does it mean I said something wrong? They see me do something I shouldn't have done? Maybe. If I know I do it, should I go talk to them about it? Absolutely. Right? Where does my responsibility end? Where does my responsibility begin? Well, I'm not a perfect person. If you follow me around for a week, I'm probably going to do something that you're going to say, man, he probably shouldn't have done that, or that offends me. Thinking about this morning also. But the truth is that the responsibility lies with the other person too. Their ability to maybe look past things or to hear what we have to say or to understand that, none of us are perfect, essentially, that we're all going to do things that could offend someone. Doctrinally offensive, there's things doctrinally we're going to have to stand for, even if people that might offend someone. Sin in someone's life, where we stand on that could be some of those things we can't really waver on. Some of those things can be offensive to people. Could say that could cause them to stumble. I think Jesus, I'm getting into my sermon a whole lot on this lesson, but I think Jesus would say the stumbling block that he's referring to here, contextually and taking into account the time, would probably be the stumbling block that the priests and the Jews were throwing before the people of Israel, the Jews. And the stumbling block they were throwing before them was that they were making basically God unattainable to the common person. They were holding themselves at such a high level and said, we're godly, we look this way, we dress this way, we act this way, we're the godly people. And unless you can get to our level of looking like we look, being who we are, then God's kind of not within your grasp, you know. And I really think that's the stumbling block that Jesus was talking about. If your right hand offends you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, what's he talking about? What they do, what they see, how they act. I mean, there's reference. So the woes of Matthew, once again, boy, I'm just eating my sermon up here. Y'all are going to have to hear my sermon after this. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Like a bad teaching, like Gary says, to teach someone wrong. But I think it's a really kind of a tough verse, you know. I mean, to cause somebody, like Gary says, not to grumble but to stumble, somebody to fall away, you know, is it's a serious consequence. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, you know, we talk about hypocrites and being hypocritical. But I mean, the truth is that if you know that to be hypocritical would be the person that would do it and say, no, I didn't, or, you know, I'm not righteous regardless, you know, not the person that messes up and say, yeah, I messed up. That's not hypocritical to do that. It's, you know, so I think, you know, we kind of confuse that sometimes. My daughter, Sydney, she's not here yet, but Sydney, every time I mess up or do something, she goes, I'm putting that in the underground bulletin. So I'm sure when I die, there'll be an underground bulletin that's probably going to have all my mess ups of my life in there because she's keeping track. But anyway, but she always says, that's going in the underground bulletin. So I'm sure that somewhere she's keeping track. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes the best thing you can show people is that, we're human and make mistakes just like everybody else. Yeah. Well, right. And that's right. That's just what Gary gets back into too. It comes down to teaching, sound teaching or not sound teaching. The same thing Jennifer said. It's there's a lot of ways to look at this, but like you say, to intentionally do it, to intentionally pull somebody down, that's a bad thing and something we should avoid. And I think that we all have a responsibility to live the best we can, do the best we can. It's like we say, we all make mistakes. I know I do. Sometimes I think it'd be easier if you just put yourself in a bubble and didn't have to live in the world, and you probably would do all right. But I think when you have to live in the world and deal with the world, you're going to have issues. I do. I think everybody in here does, and I hope I hope people understand that. Very, like Gary says, it's better for you to have the millstone cast into the fiery hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Out of Isaiah, if your eye cause you to stumble, throw it out. Very serious. Jesus wasn't kidding about this. He was being as serious as he could possibly be. Not just about doing it, but about the punishment. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good. What will you make salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another, Jesus says. It goes right back to the tax, right? Pay it, be at peace. But like he says, you got to be salty too, right? So it's kind of hard to do. We'll all be salted with fire, it says. That really goes into what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3. Our work will be tested with fire. What remains will be what we are. What's burned up didn't really matter anyway. A lot of things. Mark always has a way of being really straightforward with what he says. And pulls 3 or 4 different scriptures into this right here about Jesus talking about we're the salt of the earth. And really what Paul will talk about, the idea of being tested with fire. A lot of things he says. And yet at the end of this, I think he really sums it up. He says, be at peace with one another. That's sort of difficult to make all those things come together. To be at peace, yet be your own person, stand for God, yet as much as possible to be peaceable with people, not to cause those to stumble. A lot of things pulled up within this verse, and a lot of things pulled up with the punishment of those that can't, that do these things. So it's, pretty stiff stuff this morning. Any other comments? We're at the end of our time. Thanks for your time this morning.